Meet the fat pig who raised my husband." Her words hung in the air like cigarette smoke, ugly, slow, impossible to ignore. And when the table erupted in laughter, I realized something. Humiliation only burns when you let it. That was the moment I stopped shrinking. That was the moment I decided to remind them exactly who I was. My name is Mary Collins. I'm 54 years old, born and raised in a small town outside Dallas, Texas. And before I tell you what happened that night, before I let you inside the kind of betrayal that leaves fingerprints on your soul, I need to know something. Where are you listening from tonight? Because I've learned that stories like mine, they don't belong to one town, one family, or one mother. They travel from one kitchen table to another, carried by women who've been laughed at, dismissed, or forgotten. Now let's start where everything changed that cursed dinner. It was a Thursday evening, late spring. The kind of night when the air outside smells like honeysuckle and rain. I'd been invited begrudgingly to a dinner at my son's in-laws' mansion. A family gathering, they called it. But I knew what it really was, a showcase of power. A night for them to feel bigger, richer, cleaner than the rest of us. When I arrived, the valet hesitated before taking my keys. I could see it in his eyes, the quiet calculation. My car wasn't luxury, it was reliable. 10 years old, clean, paid in full. To me, that meant pride. To them, it meant less. Inside, the house looked like it had been built to impress angels. Marble floors so shiny you could see your face in them. Chandeliers like frozen fireworks. And people everywhere laughing, sipping, watching. Emily, my son's wife, greeted me last. She looked stunning, of course, gold dress, hair like spun silk, a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Her parents, the Whitmores, stood nearby. Her mother smelled like lilac perfume and disapproval. Her father, tall, silver-haired, commanding, extended a polite but cold hand. "Mary, so nice you can make it," he said. "I wouldn't miss it," I answered, even though we both knew I almost had. Dinner was served in a room that looked more like a museum than a dining hall long polished table. 12 golden plates, candles that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. I sat near the end, opposite my son, Daniel, who wouldn't quite meet my eyes. His tie was perfect, his posture stiff. The boy who once brought me dandelions now looked like a man trying to forget where he came from. The conversation was all stock markets, vacation homes, golf tournaments, words that made me feel like I was breathing thin air. I stayed quiet, smiling when needed. I'd learned long ago that silence is sometimes the loudest weapon. And then it happened. Emily, swirling her wine, looked across the table with that same cruel sparkle I'd seen growing in her ever since she married my son. "Oh," she said, as if suddenly remembering something amusing. "Everyone, meet Mary, the fat pig who raised my husband." Laughter followed polite, uncomfortable, but laughter nonetheless, the kind people give when they don't know where to look. For a moment, I felt the world tilt. My throat went dry, my pulse thudded in my ears. I wanted to disappear, to fold into the linen napkin and vanish, but instead I sat still. My fork touched the edge of my plate, steady. Then I saw it, her father's face. The laughter drained from him like color from a photograph. His eyes locked on mine, recognition dawning, slow and horrified. "Wait," he said softly, the words catching in his throat. You run our company?" The room froze. Even Emily's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about, Dad?" But it was too late. The silence had shifted. Power had changed hands. I looked at him, calm, almost kind. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," I said. "Caldwell Holdings acquired Whitmore Construction last quarter. I'm your new CEO." No one moved, no one breathed. I reached for my water glass, took a slow sip, and smiled. "Now," I said, "shall we continue dinner?" The rest of the evening blurred whispers, stares, the taste of roasted lamb turning to ash in my mouth. But one thought kept circling in my mind, steady and sharp. They wanted me small. They wanted me silent. And I had just reminded them I was neither. That night, after the dinner, I sat in my car for a long time, engine off, streetlights flickering across the windshield like old memories. My hands rested on the steering wheel, still trembling from what had just happened. I should have felt victorious, powerful even, but what I felt instead was hollow. Because underneath the shock and the whispers, beneath Emily's frozen smile and her father's pale face, I kept seeing Daniel, my boy, sitting there, silent, not defending, not flinching, just staring into his plate like a stranger. And that was what hurt most. I drove home through the Texas backroads, where the air still smelled like dust and rain. The night was thick and quiet, the way it used to be when Daniel and I lived in that tiny duplex behind the old Baptist church. I could almost see him again, 10 years old, knees scraped from playing outside, running up the steps yelling, "Mama, I got us dinner," and holding up a crumpled takeout bag like a trophy. Back then, we didn't have gold walls. We had faith, and sometimes faith was enough. I was 24 when Daniel was born. His father, Charles, had already started showing signs of the man he'd become: charming in public, cruel in private. He worked construction by day, drank by night, and measured his worth by how quiet I stayed. When he died in a roadside accident, people brought casseroles and pity. I brought resolve. I worked every job that would take me cleaning offices, folding shirts at the dry cleaners, managing inventory at a corner store. I used to tell Daniel bedtime stories about success, like they were fairy tales. One day, I said, we'll have our own house, one with windows that open right and floors that don't squeak when we pray. He used to smile at that. He always smiled. Even when I came home smelling like bleach, he'd hand me a towel and say, "You're the hardest working person I know, Mama. One day I'll make you proud." And he did. Lord, he did. When he got his scholarship, I sat in the back of the auditorium, clutching my purse so tight it left marks in my palms. He'd worn the same blue shirt I'd ironed 1,000 times before, the one with the tiny thread loose near the collar. When they called his name, I cried so hard I scared the woman next to me. From there, things moved fast. College, internships, a degree in business administration, my baby boy all grown up, stepping into boardrooms while I still scrubbed floors at night to help him pay rent. It was around that time he met her, Emily Whitmore. The first time he showed me her picture, I remember saying, "She's beautiful, honey, but she looks like the kind of girl who's never eaten burnt toast." He laughed then. I didn't. When I finally met her, it was at a cafe downtown, the kind of place where coffee costs what a full meal used to. She shook my hand like it might leave a stain. Perfect nails, perfect smile, not a hint of warmth behind it. "Oh, you're Mary," she said. "Daniel talks about you constantly. You raised him all by yourself, didn't you? That's so inspiring." Inspiring. I remember thinking that word was just pity dressed in pearls. Still, I smiled. I told myself to give her a chance. Love makes fools of the kindest people. But as months passed, little things began to change. Daniel started calling less, then visiting even less than that. He'd say, "Mom, Emily's family is just different. You'd love them if you understood their world." Their world. That was the first time I realized he'd stopped saying our world. By the time the engagement was announced, I barely recognized him. His shirts were sharper, his words smoother, his hugs shorter. I remember one night sitting on my porch, holding an old photo of the two of us, me with messy hair, him missing a tooth, both of us covered in pancake batter, and thinking, somewhere along the way, my boy traded love for status. People like to say money changes everything, but I've learned something truer. It doesn't change people. It reveals them. And soon enough, I was about to see just how much it would reveal in both of them. The first sign came quietly like a draft slipping through a closed door. A wedding invitation I never got to help design. Then a florist's receipt I found on social media, tagged #Whitmore Wedding, weeks before anyone told me the date. I remember staring at that post, my son in a tuxedo fitting, Emily beaming beside him, and realizing I was no longer part of the story I'd written my whole life. When Daniel finally called, his voice was light but distant, like a man standing at the edge of a canyon. "Mom, it's going to be a small ceremony," he said. "Just close family." I laughed softly. "What am I, Daniel? The mail carrier?" He didn't answer right away. The silence between us stretched so long I could hear my own heartbeat. Emily's family. They have certain expectations, he said finally. They're covering everything and, well, they want to keep it elegant. You know how appearances are. Appearances. That word cut deeper than any insult. When I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the invitation that never came, my hands shaking. The table was scratched, the chairs mismatched, but it had held more love than any ballroom ever could. The next time I saw Emily's parents was at the rehearsal dinner. I went because I refused to vanish. Her mother, Lydia, looked me up and down, her smile thin as lace. "Mary, dear," she said, touching my arm, "we didn't think you'd make it. I know it must be a bit overwhelming for someone of your background." I smiled. "Overwhelming? No, ma'am. I've cleaned bigger rooms than this." Her smile faltered. I caught Daniel's eyes across the room, the faintest flicker of embarrassment, maybe even guilt, but he said nothing. After they married, my visits grew shorter. My calls went unanswered more often. When I did come by, Emily was always just heading out. Once, I brought over a chocolate cake, Daniel's favorite since he was 8. I left it in the kitchen while I went to wash my hands. When I came back, it was gone. Emily stood at the counter, smiling, wiping her hands with a paper towel. "Oh, that? I tossed it," she said casually. "We don't really eat homemade things. I'm sure it's sentimental, though." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That cake wasn't just food, it was memory, tradition, love baked into flour and sugar. But I said nothing. I just nodded and left, the smell of cocoa following me out like a ghost. That was when I began to see their world for what it really was, polished, but hollow. Emily's family spoke in numbers and deals, not feelings. To them, people were either assets or liabilities. And my son, my Daniel, had become their most valuable acquisition. One afternoon, I overheard Lydia talking at a charity event. "He's such a good investment," she said to a friend. "Emily really landed a future executive. Mary must be thrilled. I mean, for someone from her world, my world, as if they existed on separate planets." But what they didn't know was that my world had been quietly expanding. While they spent their days sipping champagne and comparing handbags, I was building something far more enduring, Caldwell Holdings, my consulting firm. It started with a single client in a small office space above a laundromat, but within 5 years, we were handling multi-million-dollar accounts. And one of those accounts, fate has a strange sense of humor, was Whitmore Construction, Emily's family's legacy business. When my lawyers told me, I almost laughed. I remember whispering, "God doesn't always shout his justice. Sometimes he signs it in ink." I didn't tell Daniel. Not yet. Not until I had to. Because some lessons, the kind that burn arrogance down to ash, can't be taught with words. They have to be lived. It would take one dinner, one cruel joke, and one stunned silence for them to learn exactly who I was. And when that moment came, I promised myself something: I would not raise my voice. I would not fight for space at their table. I'd let them hand it to me, trembling. When the paperwork went through, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt quiet, almost holy. The email came on a Wednesday morning. Caldwell Holdings officially acquires controlling interest in Whitmore Construction. Just like that, with a few signatures and one digital transfer, the same family that had mocked my name now answered to it. I didn't gloat. I didn't even smile. I simply closed my laptop, poured myself a cup of coffee, and whispered, "Well, Lord, that's something, isn't it?" For years, I'd kept my success private. I preferred small victories over grand announcements. The business grew from consulting to full acquisition strategy. We helped companies restructure, refinance, rebuild. I built an empire not from greed, but from grit. Every penny came from late nights and long days, the kind where you forget to eat, the kind where you mop your own floors after firing half your staff to keep the company alive. By the time we landed Whitmore Construction, Caldwell Holdings had offices in 3 cities, a board of directors, and a reputation for taking broken systems and turning them to gold. But the Whitmores didn't know that. Not yet. The first time I walked into their corporate headquarters as an investor, I felt that old heat of insecurity rise in me, the same one I'd felt in their marble mansion. Their receptionist gave me that look I knew too well. Polite confusion dressed as superiority. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, forcing a smile. "Investors usually come through the executive entrance." I smiled right back. "That's fine, sweetheart. I like to see how the real work gets done." Inside, I sat at the long conference table where generations of Whitmores had made their fortunes. There was an oil painting of the patriarch over the mantel, the kind of self-portrait that screams legacy. When the meeting began, I introduced myself simply, Mary Collins, representing Caldwell Holdings. The CFO blinked, flipping through the papers in front of him. "I didn't realize you were that Caldwell," he said. I nodded, calm. "The only one that matters." I kept my distance from Daniel and Emily during those months. It wasn't easy, he called sometimes, asking about family things, small talk mostly. I could hear the strain in his voice. "Work's been stressful," he'd say. "I bet it has," I'd reply. Neither of us mentioned the company name. "Oh, I was preparing something bigger." The Team Mary wasn't just a weapon, it was a mirror. And I needed them to see themselves clearly, every crack, every cruel reflection. Then one afternoon, an embossed envelope arrived at my office. Inside, "You are cordially invited to a dinner celebrating the Whitmore family's continued success and partnership with Caldwell Holdings." I laughed, an honest, surprised laugh that echoed in my empty office. They had no idea who had signed the checks keeping their company afloat. That dinner, the same dinner that would later become legend, where Emily's laughter died mid-breath. But before that night, I spent hours standing before my closet, debating what to wear. Power doesn't need sequins, it needs presence. I chose a deep navy gown, simple but commanding, the kind of dress that whispered, "I don't need to prove anything." Before leaving, I looked at a framed photo on my desk. Daniel, age 7, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Mama's Hero." For a second, my chest tightened. I wasn't walking into that dinner for revenge. I was walking in for that little boy who once believed his mother could do anything. When I arrived at the Whitmore mansion that night, everything gleamed candles, crystal, arrogance. But something in me had changed. I wasn't the cleaner anymore. I wasn't the widow who sat alone at the back of PTA meetings. I was the woman who had built an empire from the ashes of their judgment. And I was about to take my seat at their table, not as a guest, but as the owner of the house. The valet opened my door like I was royalty. I suppose in a way, I was just not the kind of royalty they recognized. The Whitmore's mansion glowed against the night, each window blazing like a stage light. I took one steadying breath before stepping out. Inside, the house hummed with laughter and expensive perfume, the kind of place where conversations clinked like champagne glasses, delicate, hollow, ready to shatter. A waiter took my coat and offered me wine. "Red or white, ma'am?" "Neither," I said. "I came to stay sober tonight." The dining room was a picture from a magazine. Ivory walls, a mahogany table polished to a mirror, silver so bright it hurt to look at. Emily was radiant gold dress, perfect curls, a smile that never reached her eyes. She floated toward me like a hostess performing for a camera. "Mary," she cooed, "you made it." "Wouldn't have missed it," I said. My voice was soft but steady, the kind of calm that unnerves people who expect an apology. Her father, Richard Whitmore, stood at the head of the table. He greeted me with a practiced smile, his hand cool and dry. "Ah, Miss Caldwell. Wonderful to see you again." Again. If only he remembered where. Dinner began with polite chatter, the weather, the markets, a new resort Emily's mother couldn't stop bragging about. I let them talk. Sometimes silence is sharper than a blade, but Emily couldn't resist. I saw the way she glanced at her friends, that tiny smirk she got when cruelty was about to cross her lips. "Oh, everyone," she said suddenly, waving her fork in the air. "I completely forgot to introduce you properly." Her voice turned honey-sweet and venom dripped beneath it. "Meet Mary, the fat pig who raised my husband." The laughter came slow, polite at first, then louder. It wasn't the sound itself that hurt. It was the echo of every time in my life someone had looked at me and seen less. I didn't flinch. I placed my fork down gently, the silver clinking against porcelain like punctuation. Daniel's head bowed, his hands fidgeted in his lap. Not a word, not a sound. And then the room changed. It was so subtle, most didn't notice, but I saw it. Richard Whitmore's smile vanished. His hand froze halfway to his glass. Color drained from his face as his eyes locked onto mine. "Wait," he said, voice trembling. You run our company?" The room fell silent, the kind of silence that hums with panic. Emily blinked, confused. "Dad, what are you talking about?" But he didn't look at her. His gaze was still on me. I leaned forward slightly, my tone calm, gentle even. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Caldwell Holdings acquired Whitmore Construction last quarter." I paused, let the weight of it settle like dust on crystal. "I'm your new CEO." You could hear the air leave the room. Forks froze mid-air. Someone coughed. Even the candles seemed to flicker lower. Emily laughed nervously. "That's not... You're joking, right?" I looked at her, eyes steady. "Does it sound like I'm joking?" Her smile faltered. Her hand slipped from her wine glass. Across the table, Daniel finally looked up, really looked. His face went pale, then red, shame flooding every feature. I wanted to reach for him, to whisper that I forgave him, but this moment wasn't about comfort. It was about Mary. Richard cleared his throat. "Miss Caldwell, Mary, I had no idea." "I know," I said quietly. "That's what makes this so poetic." I dabbed my lips with the napkin, stood up slowly and looked around the table. "Thank you for dinner. It's been enlightening." No one spoke. The laughter that had filled the room only minutes ago had turned to stone. I turned to leave, my heels clicking against their imported marble. Each step sounded like a closing door. At the entryway, I paused and glanced back just once, not out of pride, but out of peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one shrinking. They were. That night, sleep never came. I sat by my window with a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the moon reflect off the windshield of my car. The silence was thick, not heavy with sadness, but with something deeper. Peace. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like someone waiting to be invited to belong. I was finally standing in my own name. At dawn, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Miss Caldwell?" The voice was hesitant. "This is Richard Whitmore." I almost smiled. Of course it was. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Last night was disgraceful. My daughter's behavior was, well, you saw it." "Yes," I said. "I saw it." "I had no idea," he went on, his tone shifting from embarrassment to desperation. "No idea that you were the one keeping our company alive. You've been nothing but professional and we—" He stopped himself. "I misjudged you." I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then I said calmly, "Mr. Whitmore, you didn't misjudge me. You just never tried to see me." There was a pause, then a quiet, "You're right." That call ended politely, but the ripple it started, I could feel it everywhere. By Monday, the tone in every meeting had changed. Executives who once ignored my emails now leaned forward when I spoke. People who had rolled their eyes at the outsider CEO began addressing me as ma'am with reverence. Power doesn't shout, it simply walks in and takes its seat. 2 days later, Daniel showed up at my door. He looked tired, dark circles, loosened tie, the weight of realization heavy on his face. "Mom," he said softly, "can we talk?" I gestured for him to sit. Of course. He didn't sit right away. He stood in my living room, looking at the framed photos on the mantel. Birthdays, graduations, the two of us standing outside our first apartment, smiling like the world was ours. "I didn't know," he said finally, "about your company, about any of it." "I didn't hide it," I said, "and you just stopped asking." He winced, nodding. "Emily told me you'd embarrass us, that you'd make her family uncomfortable. I thought I was protecting peace." "Peace built on disrespect isn't peace," I said quietly. He sat down then, shoulders slumped. "She's been crying all morning," he muttered. "Says she didn't mean it, that it was a joke." I shook my head. Cruelty dressed as humor is still cruelty. He looked up, eyes glassy. "I'm sorry, Mom." I studied him, the boy who once held my hand crossing the street, now a man learning humility in the hardest way possible. I wanted to stay angry, but love, the real kind, doesn't always shout either. So I reached across the table, touched his hand, and said, "I forgive you, but forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting." He nodded, silent tears slipping down his cheeks. After he left, I walked to my home office and opened the blinds. The sun was rising, soft gold spilling across my desk. My reflection glimmered faintly in the window, older, stronger, finally free. That night had shifted something inside me. For so long, I tried to prove myself worthy of their acceptance, of my son's approval, of society's permission to exist without shame. But standing in that dining room, I realized I didn't need any of it. Respect earned through endurance is stronger than any title. A week later, a bouquet arrived at my office. White lilies. A note attached. "For teaching us what real grace looks like, R.W." I smiled, placed the flowers in a vase, and moved on with my day. The world hadn't changed. But I had. It's been 3 years since that dinner. The lilies from Richard's apology long withered, but I kept the vase, not as a trophy, as a reminder that power wrapped in arrogance is fragile, and Mary always finds its way to the surface. The Whitmores still run their construction firm under my company's umbrella. We meet once a quarter. It's always professional, always polite. Emily avoids eye contact. That's fine. Some lessons leave bruises they'll never admit to. Daniel comes home more often now. Not to impress, not to apologize, just to be. He calls every Sunday morning, even if only to ask, "You had breakfast yet, Mom?" Sometimes we sit together in silence, watching the world outside my kitchen window, and that silence feels like healing. Last month, he brought someone new with him. Her name's Lily, his daughter, my granddaughter, barely 6 months old, eyes wide like her father's when he was little. When he placed her in my arms, I felt something unlock in me. That same pulse of love, fierce and unconditional, but softer this time, calmer. I whispered to her, "You come from women who don't bow." She smiled that gummy, innocent grin, and for a moment the world felt forgiven. I keep thinking back to the girl I once was, the widow scrubbing office floors, praying over overdue bills, the one people pitied, the one who used to whisper to herself, "Just keep going." She had no idea she'd become the woman in the mirror today. I still live in the same house, not because I can't afford better, but because every brick here carries my story. The porch where Daniel took his first steps, the kitchen where I used to count coins in a coffee tin, the mirror above the sink where I'd once traced the wrinkles forming and wonder if they meant failure or survival. Now when I look in that mirror, I see something else entirely. I see strength disguised as softness. I see a woman who was underestimated, and yet she built an empire quietly enough to surprise even those who mocked her. I see peace. One night, not long ago, I found myself standing on that same porch, coffee in hand, thinking about Emily, about all the people who've thrown words like stones and expected me to crumble. And I realized something. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's ownership. It's saying, "You no longer get to live in my head." I forgave Emily, not with a grand gesture, not even out loud. I forgave her because she taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn, that dignity doesn't need an audience. I've learned that revenge is fleeting, but recognition that lasts. When someone underestimates you and you rise quietly anyway, that's a kind of poetry no insult can erase. So now, whenever I mentor young women at my firm, the single mothers, the quiet ones who think no one sees them, I tell them my story, not for pity, for proof. Don't chase their tables, I say. Build your own. Because sometimes the most elegant revenge is simply thriving where they swore you couldn't. Tonight, as I write this, my lamp glowing, the air thick with that sweet Texas dusk, I glance once more at my reflection in the window. The lines on my face aren't reminders of pain anymore. They're records of persistence. And I know now, without doubt, that everything I went through, every sneer, every silence, every cruel word was shaping me into this moment. The moment where I can finally say with peace instead of anger, that betrayal lit a fire in me I never thought I had, and it still keeps me warm.